Jonas, thank you. I am very proud to present to you today Professor Nicholas Ashford. Like me, you may have seen his op-ed articles in the New York Times. One of them was "The Lies on Broadcast Media," and the other, "Not on Facebook, you're still likely being fed misinformation." At MIT, Professor Ashford is Professor of Technology and Policy and Director of Technology and Law Program. He's author of numerous books and has a beautiful resume. In fact, if I read it to you now, we wouldn't have time for the program. I thought, like Macbeth, he's received golden opinions. He holds a PhD in chemistry, a law degree from the University of Chicago. He received graduate education in economics, and among many other things, he was a chairman of the National Advisory Committee on Occupational Safety and Health, and he served as an advisor to the UN Environment Program. Also, I just saw something that relates to the present subject, and it talks about the continuity of time. Lorenzo de' Medici's librarian in the 15th century, Angelo Poliziano, in the early days of printing, said he thought that that print ushered in, and I quote, "the most stupid ideas which can in a moment be transferred into 1,000 volumes and spread abroad." And we're now dealing with that from other electronic devices. And now, with great pleasure, I introduce you to Professor Ashford.
Thank you, Morris. And it's a great pleasure to talk to a few people here on this subject, which keeps getting attention. Let me tell you a story about George Bernard Shaw, who is quite a character. But at the time the telephone was being invented, and somebody rushed into his quarters and they said, they're talking. And he said, yes, but what are they saying? So I think it's an interesting comment upon our news, how we get information. And it caused me to reflect a few years ago about the following dilemma I had. No matter many conversations I had with my colleagues at MIT and other academic institutions, I was frustrated that I could never change their minds. I mean, I thought my arguments were compelling, but I could never change their minds. On the other hand, I was able to change my students' minds easily. I would change them all the time. In fact, probably many of them wrote to me how I had changed their view on X or Y or Z. So why is it that smarter people, academics, professors, their minds couldn't be changed, but students' minds could be changed? And I don't think the answer lay in the physiology of the brain in one sense, but it does lie in the physiology of the brain in another sense. And that is, I want to start by talking a little about neuroscience and about what we know about what we know and why we know it. Now, you may all have been familiar with the term anchoring. If you, for example, believe that global climate change is a hoax, and you continue to search and read articles which reinforce the fact that climate change is a hoax, the more you read, the more you become anchored in the belief that climate change is a hoax. So there's a reinforcement, in this case, of a negative belief that climate change is not real. But there's something that more interesting than that. And the thing that's more interesting is that if you give a person a balanced view, this is the argument for climate change, this is the argument against anthropogenic climate change, that the more balanced opinions you get them to read, the more entrenched they become in their prior belief. And that's because the brain does not imprint what you already think is true in the same way as the brain imprints your prior. And so the more balanced opinion you read, the more you convinced that you were right after all. Now there's a dilemma there, isn't there? Because part of what some people have advocated in the context of misinformation, or what some people call disinformation, is that we force upon people a kind of a kind of ethic that says you have to present both sides of a question, and then your duty is done. But it turns out that that's not enough. It turns out that that's not enough. And when I mused about why I couldn't persuade my colleagues, but I can persuade my students, and I teach law and science, law and technology related classes at MIT, and Harvard students take them too. The point is, you can't ask your colleague to stand up and defend his views. You can't challenge those views. You can't ask them, where did you get that notion from? But you can do that to the students. And once you elicit a higher brain level in the discussion, once you move from the primitive brain, which is reactive, to one which requires a retooling, people's minds do change. And so the whole challenge of misinformation, whether you're talking about steal the election, or you're talking about conspiracies of one kind or another, or anti-vax information, the more you engage people at a higher neurological level, the more likely it is that they change their mind. And the opposite is true. The more you just basically challenge something which is held at a gut level without re-examination, the more entrenched people become in their priors. Now, this has a tremendous relevance for what we're trying to do with the world of misinformation, and particularly the distortion of news or political events. Although you could argue that global climate change is a technical issue, but it's also political. So what we find out is that only if you more or less can cross-examine and challenge views in a meaningful way, do people change their minds. Now, what passes for debate in this country, either in the print media or in the television sense, it's not really debate. One person presents a view, and then another person presents a view, and then they've got 30 seconds or 2 minutes to ask a question or answer a question. There in Britain, in the UK, there is a program put on by the BBC, which most of you may never have seen. It's called Hard Talk. And that's when an interrogator takes a subject like the head of the PLO or Netanyahu or somebody who doesn't believe in vaccination, and they subject them to a whole hour of cross-examination in which they are not allowed to give a soundbite which evades the question. They're grilled down, and only by watching that kind of grilling down or a cross-examination in court does somebody really, does the truth come out. And our transmission of information does not have that character in this country. It's simply a presentation of different perspectives. And as I said, from what we know about neuroscience, that doesn't change anybody's mind. And non-equally meritorious opinion are given equal time by the press and the media. You have to give equal time to the anti-vaxxers and the pro-vaccination people, even though the merits may not be the same on both sides. So with that background, let me tell you how I became very interested in this. I became very interested in this because the obsession of the policy people, even today, and I'll talk about that, is with the platform companies. The platform companies means Apple and Google and the social media. What it does not mean is the broadcast media, the talk radio, and it doesn't mean cable news, and it doesn't mean print media. So the obsession with broadcast media is that they're too large, they need to be broken up, and right now we've got some bills floating around in Congress that say that you've got to break up these large companies because they stifle innovation, which is probably not true, but they sort of give one perspective or a limited number of perspectives, and the public deserves more than that. But they have a lot of power. Anyway, we know they have a lot of power because of the people who own them have money to contribute to political campaigns, buy newspapers, buy television stations. And so it is true that they are too large uh, to give a balanced view. What's not clear at all is whether if you throw antitrust restrictions, anti-monopoly restrictions at them, that it's going to be any better. You might have a lot of smaller companies that cater to the very same people. So antitrust, the focus on the platform companies on the one hand, and on antitrust law as the cure of the influence of any of the platform companies, I think is misguided. I think is misguided completely. I think what the problem is that we don't have an occasion to examine our own views or views that are presented by other people. That's the problem. And to cure that problem, you have to do much more than apply antitrust laws. And that's why misinformation takes on a very important dimension. Now, if you, and most 70% or so of people get their news from the platform industry and from social media. If occasionally they decide to check the facts against Fox News, for example, they'll see that what they heard on social media and Fox News are the same. So what touching base occasionally with Fox News or from NBC on the other side does is it reinforces what they heard in abstract form on social media or on talk radio or whatever have you. So it's not really a check on your beliefs. In fact, it does more harm because you see the same thing written in the right-wing newspapers and the right-wing cable and the right-wing talk radio, and on the left side, not so bad, but pretty much on the left side you do as well hear the same bias, only from a different perspective. And that does not introduce you to the kind of cross-examination that I think you really need to do. So I think that the responsibility of government is to make sure that news, however enjoyed, has to be subject to fact checking and has to be subject to real evaluation, not by a company advisory committee, which is what Facebook does, but rather from a citizen jury or a commission. I know we've had trouble getting a January 6th commission lately, but we can. Basically, you could generate public juries or jury commission to basically evaluate. At a time when Walter Cronkite used to be alive, he was the most trusted journalist by anybody, by right-wing or left-wing people, because he did not play games with words. He was direct about what he was saying. And you find occasionally people who will do that, but you don't find it often enough. And so the trouble is that we really need to rein in the misinformation that is reinforced by the broadcast media, radio, television, cable, and by the print media, which hardly anybody reads anymore, but people tend to read and subscribe to the journals or the newspapers that reinforce their priors, and that is a problem. Now, the second kind of public intervention that's been talked about is to repeal what's called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives immunity to the platform companies from anybody suing them for something which is false or damaging in any way. And Congress is very inclined to remove that immunity as if somehow the platform companies are going to respond in any real way. You see, one of the ways that the platform company can defeat unwelcome news is to present now and then news on the other side, people interviewed on the other side, but you're still left with the problem that that's now how people's minds get engaged and changed. So while there is dominance in the broadcast media, by the way, by the same people who own the platform industry in many cases, you need much more than rejecting Section 230. In fact, I'm not sure that either antitrust law or repealing Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act is going to do what you need, because the media reinforce each other, and both the antitrust activities and the 230 Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act only apply to the platform industry. That's not nearly enough. Now, there's an additional problem. While we have the Federal Trade Commission, and I was delighted to see Alina Khan, who wrote a very intriguing antitrust piece, and now is the head of the Federal Trade Commission. But the truth of the matter is the Federal Trade Commission, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, all of these regulatory agencies would much rather settle a prosecution than prosecute. It costs a lot of time and a lot of lawyer money to prosecute people for doing something wrong. It's much easier to get pennies on the dollar and settle the case. And that's what ends up happening. The cases are settled and for pennies on the dollar compared to the harm that they really do. So the fact that the regulatory agencies have been asleep at the wheel because they've been underfunded is another area where you really have to change. You have to not only get somebody who's aggressive, but you have to give them the money to pursue prosecution. Now, long ago, until 1987, we had in the newspaper industry and the broadcast industry what was called the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine required people to give equal time to unequally meritorious ideas. And if you just give equal time, it doesn't give you the kind of engagement and critical thinking that you need to have. And so not even that, not even a resurrection of the Fairness Doctrine by itself will do the job unless you have an expanded Fairness Doctrine, which engages people in a way where, like the Hard Talk program in the UK, it really forces people to answer questions. They can't get away with sound bites. They can't get away with equal time. It really requires people to fact check and to have independent bodies evaluating that fact check. So in summary, what you really need is accountability. You need accountability in a way that people understand it, and not tricks of manipulation or debating techniques. And we don't have that today. Now, I know that Morris wanted me to go on an hour, but I think maybe what may be more useful now would be to open it up to commentary or questions which delve a little deeper into what I've suggested. If that's okay, Morris? You're muted, don't hear you.
I can't talk out loud. Let's see how we do in talking together then.
Okay.
You've certainly given us plenty of fodder to think about.
Sure.
So in fact, you mentioned something about Britain, for instance, and the Hard Talk. Yes. Does that work? And what is it? I never heard of it before.
Oh, it works very well. The Hard Talk is out 4 or 5 times a day. They have a seasoned interrogator, usually the same person, who will talk to a person who's made the news, who has something to say. Could be Boris Johnson in the UK, could be the opposition, could be the Church of England. It doesn't really matter. But the person who has made some statements that are questionable is subjected to defending those views, not by quoting other people, but by asking, well, how do you know that? And how do you know it's true? And how do you know the opposite isn't true? And no one is allowed to get away with a soundbite that
Mhm.
answered a different question.
So that
We
sounds
don't
very good, but suppose I say, oh, I don't care about that. I'm going down to the bar. I want to see how the Nats do this week. Uh,
There's no substitute for critical thinking. And if you people are unable or unwilling to engage in critical thinking, then there's nothing you can do. And that's why Plato often disapproved of democracy, because he thought in the end it would deteriorate into mob rule. Now, you might think that with Mr. Trump, and I'm displaying my own politics here, that what he did is he activated mob rule in more ways than one. So if somebody answers the question, how do you know that? Because I saw it on television, you know that's not an answer. You know that's not an answer any more than I read it on this newspaper or I heard it on this program. No, how do you know something is true? How do you know that it's false? Uh, Exercise critical thinking. And by the way, because I teach the law and technology related courses at MIT, law is that it's raison d'etre. Its reason for existence is to encourage the discovery of truth through critical thinking, not through the repetition of paradigms.
so it seems that would have to happen even before one gets to school.
Well, it certainly happened, but it better if you haven't gotten it from home, you better get it from school. Now, I've had a lot of schooling in my days. You mentioned my degrees and all the schooling that I got. I have 2 doctorate degrees, if you count a doctor of laws as doctorate degrees. But the most important 2 courses that I ever took in my life, I took in high school. One was on civics, how does the government work? And the second was a course called propaganda, how to recognize both industrial and government propaganda. We don't teach those courses anymore. And by the way, in a suburb of St. Louis where I grew up, the course was taught by a university professor who thought it was so important that he also taught it in one of the high schools. You had to recognize industrial propaganda and governmental propaganda when you hear it. And so if you do that and you become sensitive to it, then I'm not sure you'll believe everything the government told you or everything you hear about a miracle drug that will grow your hair on television. And you might wonder, how can they advertise these drugs on television? And the answer is because the FDA doesn't have enough people to prosecute false advertising.
Mm.
It's just that simple. You just throw enough money and enough bad messaging, and people will hear it and believe it. That's the problem.